I was born on the 15th of July, 1916.
Are you aware that I shall be recording on tape this conversation?
Yes.
Do you object to this?
No.
If you agree, your tape will be stored at the Northwest Sound Archives in Clitheroe Castle, Clitheroe, Lancashire, to be preserved there for posterity. Do you agree?
Yes.
For your information, Northwest Sound Archives is run by Lancashire County Council.
Yes.
Can you please tell me where you were born?
In Bootle, Lancashire. To be born in Bootle could give a man an inferiority complex because the town itself has rather an inferiority complex. The people of Liverpool regard Bootle as something of a joke. This is because Bootle is not really a town in the ordinary sense. It's really part of the Liverpool conurbation. It hasn't a proper town centre. You can't tell when you're going out of Bootle into Liverpool. And the Liverpool tramcars ran through Bootle, and in this way, it's not, as I say, it hasn't a proper town centre at all. It's just a built-up area.
What are your earliest memories?
Well, I can remember being in my pram, and this must be 78 years ago, but I can still see it quite clearly. I can see my mother talking to me, presumably baby talk, through the square aperture of the front of the hood.
Can you remember anything else before you went to school? Anything else of your life before you went to school?
Yes, I can remember that I played in the streets. It was an area, a gridiron section of streets, and the children played in the streets. I can remember I had a three-wheel tricycle for a time and rode it round the block. And I can remember this up to going to school, and yes.
Did you play any games before you went to school? What type of games did you play, if you did play any?
Well, there were street games going on. Usually, sometimes joined in with them, not always. I think the fact was that the children could actually play on the road at that time, and I can't remember in particular, except rounders. Rounders seem to be played a lot.
What did your parents do for a living?
Well, my father was a railwayman. He worked for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. He worked at North Mersey Station, a goods station. He was a shunting inspector, and he had had rather a hard life. He'd left school at the age of 11, and shortly after that he was the family breadwinner for a time. The family had moved about a bit, and on one occasion he came home to find his family had moved to another part of, in fact, out of Bootle into Liverpool temporarily. This was going on in what was called Bootle Village, and he eventually got, as I say, a job as what they called a jigger lad. That were the boys that cleaned out the railway wagons after they'd been used for one article and for something else, presumably. His rank was shunting inspector, which was meant that he was in charge of all the rail movements in and out of the yard.
How old were you when you started school, and where was the school?
Well, I was 5, and the school was an Oral Council school, about a quarter of a mile away from where I lived. Would you mind if I mentioned about my mother? My mother had been brought up actually on the dock wall. There was a big house there that was inhabited by the head dock gateman and his family at Canada Dock. And that's where my mother spent her early life. She was an apprentice dressmaker. She actually did, I think, 6 or 7 years or something like that, and had to walk across to another part of Liverpool every morning and back every night. She seemed, as far as I could tell, she walked everywhere. And then had to go from the Dock Road coming home and walk through the docks. The Canada Dock is quite a big area, and if it still exists, I don't know whether it's still the same. But she had to cross bridges over the locks, and so forth.
According to what you just said, your mother was working.
She was working then, but that was when she was a girl. She didn't work after she got married.
Oh, I see.
None of the married women worked in that area.
So you started school.
Yes.
What age did you say you were?
5.
Where was? Oh, you've given me the name of the
Yes,
school.
it was.
What were your first impressions of the school?
Well, in first place, I think I realised that I could cope, sort of thing, with what was going on, and in fact, I think I was a bit glad to be there by the time I was 5. I think I should have gone a bit sooner, but the way the school, the elementary school at the time was took children up to 14. They left at 14, and you had the school would be, the infants would be both sexes, but then as you went on, I think to the age of about 8 or something like that, you went up into a kind of upper school of where it would be either all boys or all girls, all part of the same building complex.
So you began to like school then?
Oh yes, it was all right then.
Did your parents show an interest in your education?
Well, they
did.
did
Support you?
They did. Although, on looking back, years later, I wish they'd been a bit more, a bit clearer about what was going on. I think, but at the time, I thought I was all right. That I was supported all right. Yes.
Have you anything else to say about your school days?
Well, at the age of 10 plus, we took what was called the scholarship. Later on it was called the 11 plus, but I failed the scholarship, but managed to get a recall to what they called the central school. Now, nobody ever used the word grammar school. The upper school was the secondary school. But I didn't get to the secondary school. The one I got to was a central school. The secondary school, that took them. You were up to the age of 16 there. The central school up to 15. We didn't. There were specialised teachers in the central school. We didn't do any Latin or anything like that, which they did do in the secondary school.
But the first school you went to, Was it a church school or not?
You mean the council school? No, it wasn't a church school. In fact, neither of them was a church school.
Did you play any games? Can you remember the games you used to play at school?
Well, the chief game is the game that all lads play, football. I mean, everybody plays football in the yard or on waste ground around the school and all that. The organised games were football. And I took part. I was not good enough to get picked for the school team or anything like that. Although I sometimes played for my house. There were 4 houses, red, blue, yellow and green. And I remember now that I was in the greenhouse. I don't mean a glass house. I mean the green was the colour we were. And sometimes I played for that, but I never played for the school.
What did you think about the teachers at your first school?
At the first school, most of them were all right. I can't really recall anything particular about them, except one. One was quite outstanding because he was a bully, and he did frighten the life out of us all. And he was well. I don't think he was a very good teacher, but that's looking back. And the poor man must have been dead a long time by now.
Did you have any idea that your character was being formed by association with good teachers?
Yes, but there were odd things, you know. You know, in those days, there were no married women teachers, unless they were widowed. If a woman teacher wanted to get married, she had to leave teaching.
Are you sure about that?
Oh, I'm quite certain. In fact, on several occasions, they'd make a bit of a show in the school about one of the young women leaving, and you know, and it was always she was leaving to get married. And they used that phrase. She was leaving to get married. They were not allowed to be teachers if they were married. Unless there was. I remember a certain lady who used to. She was a bit of a character. She used to go to the school on a bicycle, and she was Mrs. Milroy, but she was the only Mrs. there but she was a widow.
I see. What were your teachers like in your what you called your secondary school, or was it
the central school?
School?
Well, they were pretty good on the whole. I mean, I think these were really they were all men then. You know, there were no women teachers there, but they were pretty good. And in particular, I can remember the literature. My master took us for literature, and we'd go through a book, and he would talk about it and ask for comments from us and so forth, and we did quite a bit of writing. But he introduced me to the joys of Mark Twain, and because we read Tom Sawyer, and in fact I think that was something of a turning point with me, because I've realised since then that there are 2 sorts of people in the world: those who have read Mark Twain and those who haven't. But I read all the Mark Twain I could get hold of for quite some time. The geography man was very, very good, who gave me old copies that he had of National Geographical magazines, and these had accounts of journeys in stupendous country, like, for instance, the Himalayas and so on. And all this caught my imagination very much. We had a very good maths man, and we went as far as doing things like logarithms and so forth.
That was up to the age of 15.
Yes,
You left at 15, I presume.
yes.
What was your first job?
Well, I was out of work for a long time. There was very little work about. And of course, the not having been to a secondary school, not having taken matric or school certificate, I had no paper qualifications. And in those times, it's almost, I can say it's really literally true that you needed paper qualifications to push a wheelbarrow. I can remember on at one occasion at least turning up where a job had been advertised and the street being full of young lads like myself. We were jostling each other, and every now and then a man had come to the door and called one or two in for an interview. I didn't even get through the door. But that's, I think, fairly typical of the times. Anyway, eventually I started working for my uncle, who had a sort of one-man business in Chinatown, part of Liverpool, and I actually enjoyed working with him. He did all sorts of things, from repairing roofs to repairing drains to and all sorts of things. A lot to do with metalwork. And he had connections in various places, engineering works and such like. So it was really quite good, that. His workshop was at the back of a house which was inhabited by a Chinese family, and we got to it through a tunnel, really, under part of the house. And it's rather surprising that he sort of did so many jobs and did so many contracts, largely by contracting out sort of thing. But it was that he knew everybody in Liverpool, I think, who did work of this nature. And this, as I say, being in Chinatown, I came to know my way around that part of Liverpool. And there was a very friendly atmosphere about that part of Liverpool. There was, most of the people that you saw were not Caucasian. They were black or yellow, really. Shops were a bit peculiar, and one thing and another, but that's I think the things were freer, really. I mean, nowadays if you put anything down, it disappears. Well, in those days, I think people were more honest and so forth than they are now.
Did you find that generally is that a general statement, or is it just about Chinatown?
Oh no, that's a general statement, really. Yeah. But Chinatown was quite a pleasant place to work in.
How long did that job last?
Oh, it must have been a couple of years, I think, that I was there, and so on. Can't remember properly.
Where did you go after that job?
Well, I got a job with the Bootle Corporation in the Parks Department. It wasn't a job I liked, at least I didn't like it as far as wanting to grow plants or anything like that. But it became good in some ways. There was a good companionship. There were a couple of young fellows like myself, and one of them in charge of us, who was a bit older. And for quite a long time, we got along together, looking after a couple of bowling greens and the tennis courts. I was the one in charge of the tennis courts, really, but we all worked together quite a lot of the time. And there were little gardens in the streets. which surrounded by little bits of little railings that you could step over, and which we had to go and work on these and try and get the weeds out of them and so forth.
Pretty much similar to present day with these gardens, isn't it?
Yes, I don't think there's been any great technological advances in that line, but anyway, we got along. There were a lot of unemployed, and a thing that I should have mentioned perhaps a bit sooner, that it wasn't uncommon to see children in bare feet. Some of the children attending those schools had no shoes.
And did they not wear shoes of any kind in winter?
Well, I'm not really all that sure about this, but I rather think they got really hardened, because, or perhaps they might keep a pair of shoes or boots or whatever for really bad weather. But if it wasn't, if the weather was reasonable, they'd be wearing bare feet.
And this
so
was
to
an
speak.
economic necessity.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And you saw this.
Yes, there was a free breakfast for the very poor, where the children, they were put on some sort of a register, and they could turn up at this place, and they'd get a free breakfast every morning before going to school.
How old were you when you finished there then?
At the corporation?
Yeah, the corporation.
Well, I finished up actually working in the greenhouses, and from there I went into the army because I was called up. The war came along.
How old were you then?
I must have been 22, I think. And incidentally, when the war started, we had trenches dug in the parks, and in fact we had a rota. We had where we stayed all night in the park in case there was an air raid. But this was at the beginning of the war, and no air raids happened. And in fact, what the system we had was that you spent the night in a bowling green hut with a roaring fire going, but listening all the time in case the sirens went. In which case, you were there to watch the people going into these shelters that had been dug.
Were you an air raid warden?
Oh no, I was just an employee of the parks, but this was something that we were doing because of the war being on, really. And this went on until I was called up properly, and then I, of course, went to the. Eventually, was called up, and went into the army. They sent me a railway ticket to Chesterfield, where I came out of the station at Chesterfield, and there were about 300 all like me, and they just lined us up, put us in wagons, and took us to Matlock Bath. Actually, they could have got us to Matlock by rail a lot easier than the way they did do it. But I spent the next couple of months in this training company in Matlock Bath. I'd learned to drive a car, and I'd passed the test. And so when some officer came and asked all men to fall out who could drive, I was one of those. There were only about 1 in 10 of us fell out, but they marched us round to the cookhouse, and we had continuous cookhouse fatigues to do for a couple of months while they taught the others to drive. This didn't please me at all, because I'd realised that actually being in the army, I might as well try and get on in it. But this this sort of knocked any kind of enthusiasm like that out of me. Incidentally, you could, in a way, say a lot of the men called up at the time were practically virtually conscientious objectors, in that they were there with great misgivings, as I was myself, that the war had been sort of forced upon us. We didn't have any of the jingoistic feeling about I don't think there was much of that at all, like that we know that there was at the beginning of the First World War. But the feeling was that we were stuck with this war, and the sooner we got it over and finished, the better, and so forth. For my part, I had a great fear of the conditions that had taken place in the First World War, when men went over the top, and that I wondered all the time whether I'd have the nerve, or whether I'd be able to do what I know men had done in the First World War, and I was really secretly terrified. I don't think I was the only one, but I'm terrified of this sort of situation coming about. Actually, it never did. The Second World War was very different in many ways. Anyway, Matlock Bath, at the end we came to the end of the fatigues, and got a bit of driving, but the general scheme was that when they had nothing else to do with you, they gave you a driving test. And by the time you got into third gear, they said, right, you're all right, move the next one in. This is literally what was going on. Another thing was that the officers would sometimes come to you and say, like when you were not on parade, they'd do, and I'd say, are you conscript or volunteer? Something like that. And I'd have to say I was a conscript. They wouldn't say anything else. They'd walk away then. I think they'd been given orders only to talk to volunteers. And I think the idea was that when there were stripes to be given out, they'd go to the volunteers. Now, back in the Bootle Corporation, we'd been told not to volunteer. One or two had volunteered to begin with, because they had more choice of what they went into, you see. But the corporation was going to make up our wages for the duration. Now this was money, this was very important. And we were told if we volunteered, the corporation wouldn't make up our wages. So from henceforth, we all waited to be conscripted. And anyway, that's the way in Matlock Bath. Quite distinctly, you were nobody if you were a. Incidentally, another thing that about the way the army was run, and it may have improved since, but the good old English class system, which operates in Civvy Street pretty well, but it's rampant in the army. They have known an officer, I remember a major distinctly, standing about a yard away from me and ordering the sergeant major to ask me a question. He couldn't ask it himself because he wasn't going to talk to the lower ranks. He was only going to do it through the NCO, or the highest rank NCO around, and that's this British class system which I think nearly lost us the war, perhaps, because you got these second lieutenants who had been to a public school or something like that, and driving round in little Austinate staff car, so with golf clubs in the back and things like that. They hadn't a clue of what they were supposed to be doing, I think. But that's by and large, that's just sort of thing that was going on while we were being shunted around from pillar to post in Britain. But as it went on, things changed a bit later, because we eventually found ourselves at Canada Dock, Liverpool, embarking. I was embarking on the SS Strathallan to go abroad. And what I didn't know, I had managed to get a message home by jumping out the ranks and phoning to say where I was, because I was only 3 or 4 miles away from home, actually, at that time. And that my wife, well, she wasn't my wife then, she was my girlfriend, she and my father actually got onto the quay there, but I never saw them and they never saw me. And eventually the convoy moved out. There were 10 ships in the convoy, all pretty big. It was, and pretty fast, I think, because I suppose they had to have convoys, the convoy's as fast as its slowest ship. So, out we went across the North Atlantic and zigzagged all the time. It made it rather difficult to tell which way you were going, except that as this was taking place in November, the daylight got shorter, it got colder, the waves got bigger, and for a while we were in a fully fledged North Atlantic storm. I'd never seen anything like it. I couldn't believe that ships of 20-odd thousand tons could be tossed about as they were being, with these massive mountainous waves that moved along. Anyway, I was sick for a while, but I wasn't as sick as some of them. I don't think some of them really came up for air until we got into further south eventually, and came into Freetown. Freetown, Sierra Leone, and this was my first glimpse of Africa. In fact, my first glimpse of anywhere outside Britain, and I was very impressed actually with seeing these mountains on one side of the harbour and so forth. We never went ashore. The boats all stayed in the middle of the harbour, which is big. We were told that we didn't need our mosquito nets because mosquitoes can't fly more than half a mile. Well, that's a lie, they can. And but I think what it was very striking was that while these boats were plugging along at about 18 knots, we could stand the heat. It was very pleasant. But when they all came to rest in Freetown Harbour, it was like being in the middle of an enormous oven. Ooh, it was absolutely almost unbearable. Anyway, we were only there a couple of days, I think. Never went ashore, as I say. And then off we went again round the Cape of Good Hope, where there were flying fishes all over the place at one stage. Everywhere you look, you could see flying fish. And we never saw the Cape Table Mountain or any of that. We never got close enough, but we came into Durban and had 4 days at Durban, which were quite pleasant because it was midsummer there. Not that I think that makes much difference in Durban. And we had enjoyed walking about with seeing all the lights on. You see, back in Britain, they had the blackout, and you know, the cars only had little pinpoints of light on them and so forth, and that in Durban there was neon lights and all sorts. So it was pleasant to walk around just in the town under the lights. You see, it was outside the water, and I had a pleasant time. Being a railway buff, I had a good look at the South African railways. They had and still have magnificent railway system. And I did a couple of train journeys and so forth, and then did another journey where I was sent back. Well, a man had taken me to have dinner with him, which is the sort of thing they were doing, and then finding out that I had a long wait before there would be another train back, ordered a taxi, went to his back door and shouted, and a black man came to the back door, and he said something to him in possibly Swahili or something, and next thing was I was taken back to the 20-odd miles to Durban in a taxi. The back of the taxi being full of the driver's friends, men and women. I don't know how many of them there were, but they crammed themselves into the back of the taxi, presumably for the ride. But as soon as we got going, they started singing blues. And they could sing, they were harmonising. Oh, it was marvellous. And we went through the countryside, it's quite lovely countryside, down there back to Durban, with this gang behind me singing the blues. Anyway, back to the ship, of course. I was sleeping on board the ship. And then eventually we left Durban.
Where did you go then?
Sailed up through the Mozambique Channel, which in contrast to the North Atlantic was as calm as a mill pond. And in fact, I never believed that you'd see ships, big ocean-going ships, reflected in the water. Well, they weren't quite reflected, but the outline was there. You know, the water was had gone so calm. That didn't last. When we came out of the Mozambique Channel, which is the area of water between Madagascar and the African mainland, it became more normal, and the next thing of interest was sailing through the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, which happened at sunset, and with red light from the sky, and all the well, there's no vegetation to speak of around there. The straits are studded with islands, all seemingly composed of sandstone, and as the scenery was red, and the sky was red, the sea was red, and presumably that's why it's called the Red Sea. We went through from there to Suez. Then we sailed through the Suez Canal to Port Said, where we disembarked. They took us then to, I think we went by train, that's right, yes. They put us in a train. Not for a very long journey, just to a place called El Tahag, where we were marched up onto the desert, and this was during the night, and given a tent, and next morning we found that we were in what you might call a sort of canvas city. There were just tents going for miles and miles and miles, with the tarmac road going through the middle. But it was pretty featureless. When we had to go somewhere in it, it was difficult to find where we'd get back to the same place because everywhere looked exactly alike. Anyway, from El Tahag, I twice got leave to go to Cairo, and I was very anxious to see the pyramids, and found out that you got the number 13 tramcar, which is it's about an hour's run, and what it's like now, I don't know, but you came to the end of a big main road where the tram stopped, and then walked on onto the desert, and there were the pyramids, the Sphinx. You know, it was a marvelous thing for me to see and so forth. I paid a dragoman as a sort of guide with his flowing robes and one thing. They look quite bloodthirsty, these people, and I paid him to take me up to the top of the Great Pyramid. That's the highest one, which has the flat top, and stood up there, and so forth. Then he took me inside, and then charged me extra for lighting. In fact, there were two of them, and I'd gone through this narrow passageway with one in front of me, one behind me, but they lit magnesium flares. And what you did was you tried to look round as quickly as you could while the magnesium flare was on, which lasted about a second. But my impression of inside was that if they'd had decent lighting, it would have been there would have been quite a lot to see. But that was what they were doing then. And anyway, out came. I went back to the pyramid a couple of nights later, and knowing the route up to the top, went up myself. Didn't bother engaging any dragomen. And actually watched the sun going down from the top of the Great Pyramid. Quite a spectacular sight, really. Anyway, and then back into Cairo, where the Egyptians, well, they were making as much money as they could out of the British troops being there, because we were the mainstay of their economy, I think, at the time. All the cafes it was egg and chips wherever you went, and so back to a cafe for egg and chips, and so forth. And then I did go into one of the so-called cabarets. They were calling them cabarets. That was the word that was being used, but really it was a dance hall, and there was a band. The one I went into had a band playing. Before long, I was playing the piano with them. I didn't play for the belly dancers, so I forget what the girl dancers that came in every now and then at intervals. The band pianist played for them. I wouldn't have known where to start or how to finish or anything. I don't really know how they understood it, because it was different sort of music altogether. But anyway, the band was playing things, the songs of the time, which was Somebody Stole My Girl and all that sort of thing. And and in fact, while I was in Cairo on that leave, I spent every night there playing.
You didn't tell me that you could play the piano.
Well, I'd had my first lesson when I was 7, and by the time I was about 10 or 11, I was a fairly proficient pianist. But I was always being told off for busking. I was playing by ear, I was adapting and so forth, which I wasn't really supposed to do. I was supposed to learn pieces and play them exactly as the composer had written them. And all my life I've been, I've never played the same thing the same way twice, I don't think. But I'd been in dance bands from the age of about 18, and it had helped to supplement my living a bit. I mean, we were playing for 5 shillings a night, which isn't much, but
5 shillings each?
yes. Oh yes, I got my 5 shillings, and in fact, by the time that's how I came to be a driver. Really, I'd saved up my 5 shillings, and by the end of one winter, I had enough to buy a car, a second-hand one, clean-hand, in fact, and actually get it taxed and insured. That left me with a couple of coppers for petrol out of £20, which made me. I thought I was a rich man then. Anybody who had £20, you know, was doing pretty well then.
So those musical skills you'd acquired came in handy in Cairo.
Oh yes, aye. And actually on the boat on the boat too, and at various places. In fact, there were I think on the Strathallan there'd been I think 4 pianos, and in fact in one place we had practically a first-class dance band going. I also had my piano accordion with me, and on occasions I'd play the accordion for a sort of impromptu concerts that we'd do. I'd been doing this in England when we were doing this shunting about,